Well, hello and welcome back. I'm your friend Inside. So today we're going to learn something special because what we will learn today will definitely affect our job seeking process. Because if we know that kind of knowledge, it will help us to pass the interview, especially the technical part of that interview. So let's get started. The topic we are going to talk about is about the React. This is a framework for the front-end website development. Why know this? Because currently, as I think I would have more chance to apply for this role. So let's get started. The first topic is fundamental topics. It's about the create a React app. You definitely know how to create a React app, don't you? Here you go. This is how you create a React app. It's quite simple for now. And you can know something about the JSX. So what is a JSX? Let me just create a new app so that I could demonstrate you those concepts. Alright, here we go. So what is the JSX? We all know that the JS means JavaScript code, which is a code that we normally do when we're doing the front-end development. And for now, since we are doing the React development, what we would do is to mix the JavaScript code along with the HTML code. For example, something like this. Yeah, something like this. So in this way, if we mix the JavaScript and HTML together, then we call that kind of code JSX. Well, that's my understanding, but the real definition for it is JSX is a React extension to the JavaScript language syntax, which provides a way to structure component rendering using syntax familiar to many developers. It is similar in appearance to HTML. Well, it's true. It's a mix of the HTML and the JavaScript. And then we come with the components. So what is this? It means a part of the UI, and it has two classes, the functional components and class components. Now what you say is a function component, so that's why you could say it is a function, and for this function it will return you a component. Well, you may not know what I was trying to say. Let me just run it quickly. Here I could define a new component, like function new components. It will only return you the hello world tag, and we will use that right in here. Okay, now if we go back to the page, well, we should see something right in here, but I don't see anything. That's weird. Okay, let me remove this image first, then remove this paragraph or even this link. I still do not see anything. Is that right? Not sure. How about we just return a div? Well, it says a new component is defined but never used. That's weird. I have used it right here. Okay, now we got this. So why we cannot make it work? It is because for the components, the len should be a capitalized one. Only in this way, that component will get rendered without any problem. And for now, since this components will only return you a simple tag, so that's why we also call this a component. Anyway, let me just change this word. Okay, now we see it right in here. For the React component class, it's something different. Instead of defining a function, in this case, you will define a class. Here we go. We got this component right here. So now, as you could say, we have the class definition for a component, which is cool. And then comes with the props and states. For the props, this is a property. It's a variable that you could pass by or pass down from the parent component to its child components. So that's why here you could use that property .len because we have defined it right in here. And then comes with the states. So what is the states? Here we go. When you define a new class component, you could use the constructor to define its state. We call it state, but actually it's just some variables that inside of a class component that you could use. For example, here we got the date, current date as the variable that we want to use. And then how we use that? We could say this that state that variable name. Something like that. Now let's go back to the page. You could say that we could get the time right in here. Well, the problem is how can you update that time? You could do this. For example, here, instead of a single tag, we could also return it, a button. And for this button, I'm gonna call it update the time, and I'm gonna give it a function that will be set state the date equal to a new variable. For now, if I hit this button, you would see the seconds will get updated if I click that button. So now you know what is the property and what is the state of a component. Let me just repeat it again. For the properties, it's some variables that could get passed down from the parent to its children. And for the state, it's just the variables that you could use inside of a component. And what is the conditional rendering? This is simple. For example, now I define a new tag. This tag that will be, well, we'll need two tags. One is odd, another is even. We'll say if the seconds divided by 2, if we get the remainder, if it's equal to 0, that means it's an even 1. And if it does not equal to 0, then it is odd 1. So in this case, this is a conditional rendering. Let me say if it's working. Here we go. If we update the time, you'll see sometimes it is even, sometimes it is odd. This is conditional rendering. Alright, then we're gonna come into the component life cycle. So what is the life cycle for the React components? Well, it's just the states change along a component life. I mean, from the initialized part to the unmounting part. But it basically has two phrases. The first one is the initial phrase, and then the mounting phrase, the updating phrase, and the unmounting phrase. Well, you can think of it like this. First, you're gonna create that component, right? After you have created that component, you have to mount it to the web page. And now you could say the initiate user interface or view from the screen, but it has to get updated. So here comes with the updating phrase. And after that, when you switch around, maybe you go to another page, then the old component will no longer needed. In this case, it will get into the unmounting phrase. And in the initial phrase, it got the get default props. It is used to specify the default value of this props. It is invoked before the creation of the components or any props from the parent is passed into it. And then comes with the get initiate state. It is used to specify the default value of this state. It is invoked before the creation of the components. That makes sense because for components, basically you got two inputs. The one is the props, another is the state. I mean the default state. And then comes with the mounting phrase. For this one, we have a few functions that would get called when you are using the class components. For example, the components will mount. This is invoked immediately before a component gets rendered into the DOM. In this case, when you call setState inside this method, the component will not re-render, and then it's a component did mount. This is invoked immediately after a component gets rendered and placed on the DOM. Now you can do any DOM querying operations. So when this function get called, that component was already get mounted on the web page. So in this case, you could use some reference technique to get the elements itself about that component. Then you could do some operations with it. That's fine. And then for the render function, this method is defined in each and every component. It is responsible for returning a single row HTML code element. If you don't want to render anything, you can return a null or false value so that nothing will get displayed on the page. And for the updating phase, it is the next phase of the life cycle of a component for the React framework. Here we get the new props and change states. This phrase also allows to handle user interaction and provide communication with the component's hierarchy. The main arm of this phrase is to ensure the component is displaying the latest version of itself. Unlike the birth or death phrase, this phrase repeats over and over again. This phrase consists of the following methods. Components will receive props. This is invoked when a component receives new props. If you want to update the state in response to prop changes, you should compare this props and the next props to perform state transition by using this setState method. Should component update, this is invoked when a component decides any changes or updation to the DOM. It allows you to control the component's behavior of updating itself. If this method returns true, the component will update. Otherwise, the component will skip the updating. Okay, so you could use this method need to decide or do an interception for the updating process, so that sometimes you could prevent the frequently updates behavior of your website or a component. Component will updates. This is invoked just before the component's updating occurs. Here, you can change the component state by invoking this dataset method. It will not be caught if should component updates returns false. Render. This is invoked to examine this data props and this state and return one of the following types: the React elements, arrays, and fragments, booleans or none, string, and number. If should component update returns false, the code inside render will be invoked again to ensure the component displays itself properly. I think this is probably wrong somehow. Should component updates returns true, the component will update. Should component returns false, the code of render will also be invoked again. So that's definitely wrong, I think. But I don't know. I'm gonna do a search. Okay, here we go. This is the right behavior. By default, component will update will return true. And if it returns false, then the render and the component will update and component did update method does not get invoked. That's right. If the component shouldn't get updated, then all those functions like render and those two functions should not get invoked. That's for sure. So for somehow this article is wrong here. Component did update. It is invoked immediately after the component's updating occurs. If this method or in this method, you can put any code inside once the update happens. And for the unmounting phrase, it is the final phase of the React component life cycle. It is called when a component instance is destroyed and unmounted from the DOM. So what is a DOM? I think it's the virtual elements. The document object model is a programming API for HTML and XML documents. Well, that's true because in the JavaScript, you could also create a new element object in the memory, as I think. Well, by the way, for those Chinese, they talk about the DOM or not, but if you ask them what is a DOM exactly, they don't know how to answer you because they are fucking idiot. Sorry, because they just don't know the full name of that object. So remember this, it's the document object model. And for the component will unmount, this is a function that will get caught or get invoked immediately before a component is destroyed and unmounted permanently. It performs any necessary cleanup related tasks such as invalidating timers, event listener, canceling network requests, and cleaning up the DOM elements. Okay, so far we have covered the life cycle of a React component, but actually for other framework it also has the same life cycle because in the base or say in the deep theory they are pretty much the same. And then comes with the list and keys. What is that? The list, it can be a JavaScript concept. For example, it can be a list, something like this, 1 2 3 4 5. But also it could be something else. For example, now I'm going to create a new function, list of divs. For this time we will, instead of return the GSX, we'll just return a JavaScript like elements. For example, here I'm gonna return a list. I don't know if it's gonna work or not, but let me try it out right in here. Okay, now you could say that we got a list of elements. I'm not returning the HTML code directly, but I'm returning a list of HTML code. I don't know if you can understand this or not, but this is a concept for the list here. And then comes with the composition and inheritance. What is that? For now, actually, we are already using the components and composition and inheritance. Why? Because for now, you can see here we got basically 3 tags, 1 2 3 4. This is kind of the combination of HTML code or tags. So this is the concept of composition. And for the inheritance, well, for now we got a app components, but inside of it we also got a list of divs. It's like the parent and child relationship. So that's why here they call it inheritance. And then comes with the hooks function. Well, this is even much simpler than you ever think it would be. For example, now if we go back to the HTML code. For the new components, I'm gonna use a hook function. So that'll be count, set a count. We use the React use states. We will set that count variable to have a default value, which is 0, but we could also set it to -1. That's fine. And then I'm gonna use that counts variable to do a display. And it's not finished yet. We could also say that we're gonna have a button where whenever we collect that button, that count variable will get a number added up. So let me try it here. Here we go. If we collect this button, you'll see the number goes up and up. That's cool. And in this case, we are not using some fancy stuff, but the set stack hook. So for the hook function, at least for the use state, it will return you two variables. One is a variable that you could use to display the variable or get the value of that variable. Then another function is a function that you could use to update that variable. Okay, that's simple. And then comes with the use effect. What is that? Well, it's kind of like the function that you would use in the onMounting phrase. For example, the components will not this one. Here we go. It's kind of like the component will mount function and the component did mount function. It's the same. For example, here we could say use effects, and at the beginning, I want to set that count number to 100. So in this case, whenever we refresh this page, the number will go to 100. Why? Because that's the function we call after that component get mounted. Well, we could even have another variable. And we only do that kind of change when another variable got changed. For example, for now, if we collect that button, we'll say set another variable equal to count plus 1. So for now, if I collect this button, that's weird. Okay, now I got it. So we could even give it another variable so that it means the use effect will only get recorded if another variable get changed. So for now, if we collect that button, it will set another variable to be plus by 1. So in this case, whenever I collect this button, you would see the use effect function or the string will get printed out by 1. So for the use effect function, it will not only get called after the component get mounted, it will also get called when the component get refreshed, because it's also equal to the component's did updates right in here. So the use effect equal to the component did mounts and the component did updates, they equal to the both function. Okay, now we basically understand the use effect and the use effect function, which means we have the knowledge of the fundamentals of the React framework. Now we're gonna go to some advanced topics. For example, the hooks. How can you write in your own hooks? How can you do that? Well, one thing I forgot to tell you is that when you are using the use effect function, if you return a function, that function will get called when it is time to clean up that component. It's like the component will unmount function. Alright, here's a topic called using custom hooks. It is similar to the idea of writing your own hooks, but with writing your own hooks, it's a wrong sentence in here or wrong statement in here. It's not about creating your own hooks. It's about how you compose the hook function together to create a new function that you could use in other places. For example, here, if you got a function like this, use friend states, it will receive a friend ID, and after that it will return you if that user is online or not. Of course, inside of that you get the use effect function, but that's okay. This is just a function, and then you use that function to create your own code. For example, here is it online, and you use that value. For me, it's like well, you could just use that functionality, and you don't have to worry about the cleanup for it. For example, here the use effects function is somehow get hidden from the abstraction use right in here. But anyway, I don't think that's a hard concept. It's just something like compose those functions together to form a new function, kind of like that. Nothing special about it. But for this case, it's the only difference, or the only difference is that for those functions that you are using, it uses the hooks function. That's all. And there we also get some new functions, for example, or different kind of hooks. The use callback function. Okay, so what is the use callback function? It's just some function that will get called when those dependencies, for example, the variable a and b here gets changed. If the two variable gets changed, we do something. That's all. That's how simple it is. And then we're gonna use ref, which is the use reference. It's a function that you could use to get the reference of HTML elements. For example, here you use the use reference function to get a variable, and you pass that variable to the ref keyword of a HTML tag, so that by doing so, you could get that element's variable, so that you could do some operations with it. And then it's the use memo. What is that? Okay, for this function, it's kind of like the computed function in the Vue.js framework, where you give it the dependencies variables, for example here a and b, and you give it a function to take the a and b. It will return you a new value, which is a memorized value, and that value will get changed when the dependencies get changed. For this function, it will get running during the rendering, so you'd better avoid to do some expensive calculations out there, because it will take a lot of time. And also, if you wanted to get some resources from the internet, it's also a time-consuming task. So in this case, you'd better put those tasks into the use effect function instead of the use memorized value function. Well, for somehow I think the keyword memorized is not right for this case. It should be computed. Anyway, that's not my topic here. You just have to know how to use it. Use reducer. What is that? Okay, here we go. Now you could see that we got a keyword called use reducer. What it will do? First, it will take you the initiated states. In this case, it's a list of objects, and then comes with a reducer right in here. It will take the states and the action. You could do something for the state based on different actions. Here, it seems like the action it's a string. For no matter what kind of action you prefer, you will always return the states. You can return the original one by default, which is this list, or you could return the modified version of the original states. It depends on you. So by using this function, you could avoid using the reducer or redux library somehow. And what is the use context? Well, it's kind of like a global storm. For example, here, if you have created a context with this variable or this object, you could use it by wrap your old components inside of the context that you have defined with start provider and with a value. This is the default state, I think, or the default value, and then you could pass it a new value. It depends on you. And after that, inside of the child, you could somehow reuse the variable that you have defined inside of that context. For example, here you could say use context with the context you have defined here, and then you could use it like the zine.url. It is that simple. It's kind of like the global storm. I hope you understand what I was trying to say. Okay. What is render props? I have not heard about that. Oh, I got it. So in this case, a component with a render prop takes a function that returns a React element and calls it instead of implementing its own render logic. So that means even if you have predefined that components, if you pass it a render keyword or parameters, you give it a function, and that function will return a new, let's say, HTML code, then it will use that render function instead of the original one. Okay, so what is ref? Well, it's a theme like the use ref. It's a same thing. And what is the React context? Well, the inner logic for the class components. If you wanna use the context, it's a theme in the class component, but it might be harder for you to understand. For example, here, if you want to use that context you have created, at the first you're gonna use the provider. That's for sure. But then you have to also say something like this. as a static context type equal to that context you have defined. Then you call your variable by using this start with your variable length. This can be more tricky to recognize than using the hook function. I mean, by using the use context function, it would give you a clear syntax, a more clear syntax. Alright, let's go on. High order components. What is that? High-order components. A high-order component is an advanced technique in React for reusing component logic. HOCs are not part of the React API. They are a pattern that emerges from React's compositional nature. Consequently, a higher-order component is a function that takes a component and and returns a new component. Wow, that's something that I do not hear before. Well, but you can think it as a wrapper of a function, but instead, for now, you are not going to wrap a function, you are going to wrap a component. Well, it's something like this. For example, now, if you want to define the comment list, what you do first is to define the components, the comments component first, because you know the comment list is composed or was composed by a lot of comments components. I don't know if you understand what I was trying to say or not, but this is the case. Or you can think it like if you want to define an article, what do you do first? You have to define each sentence first. And if you want to define a sentence component, what do you do first? You have to define the word component first, because a sentence was composed by multiple words. Alright, so that's a high order component. Let's go to the next one. Portals. What is a portals? Portals provide a first-class way to render children into a DOM node that exists outside of the DOM hierarchy of the parent components. Normally, when you return an element from a component's render method, it's mounted into the DOM as a child of the nearest parent's node. For example, here, the React mounts a new div and renders the children into it. Yeah, that's how I think about it. However, sometimes it's useful to insert a child into a different location in the DOM. Okay, so you wanted to put the children components into a different node if you give it an HTML element or node, whatever. Well, I don't know if I could understand that or not, but let me just read it. Event bounding, what is that? Sorry. Event bubbling through portals. Sorry about that. Even though a portal can be anywhere in the DOM tree, it behaves like a normal React child in every other way. Features like context work exactly the same regardless of whether the child is a portal. The portal still exists in the React tree regardless of position in the DOM tree. This includes event bubbling. An event fired from inside a portal will propagate to ancestors in the containing React tree, even if those elements are not ancestors in the DOM tree. Assuming the following HTML structure, we get two divs. A parent component in app road would be able to catch and uncatch bubbling events from the sibling node. How? Siblings. The two containers are siblings in the DOM. So what is the siblings? It means brother and sisters. I mean, they are in the same hierarchy level. We still do not know why they need to use the portal technique. Here, the people says that it is useful when rendering components such as models, tool tabs, pop-up messages, and some more. But in my opinion, we don't have to create those things by our own. But instead, we will use some third-party library to do those kind of jobs. So in theory, we will not have a chance to use the portal function at all. Aero boundaries. What is that? Introducing Aero boundaries. A JavaScript error in a part of the UI shouldn't break the whole app. To solve this problem for React users, React 16 introduces a new concept of an Aero boundary. Aero boundaries are React components that catch JavaScript errors anywhere in their child component tree, log those errors, and display a fallback UI instead of the component tree that crashed. Okay, here you get a static function function where you could define when error happens, what kind of state you want to have. And then if that error state indeed has happened, then you could rendering your own customer error message. And then you could just wrap your old components into the Aero Boundary that you have defined. That's okay, because in the Blighter framework, they also have a method for you to define the, let's say, the error message when an error happened inside of a widget. And what is the fiber architecture? The goal of React Fiber is to increase its suitability for areas like animation, layout, and gestures. Its headline feature is incremental rendering, the ability to split rendering work into chunks and string it out over multiple frames. What is that? Alright, now I got an idea of the fiber architecture. Well, they're just talking about the inner theory of how they have created the React framework, or what is the inner theory of the React framework. It's talking about the node tree, something like this, how the React framework updates those nodes, something like that. If you ask me, I would say I don't give a damn about how that framework was able to do that kind of work. I only care about the work itself. As long as it is work, then we could use it, and that's all. But if you are a senior developer, like you have maybe 5 or 10 years of experience, you could definitely go to check about the inner theory of the framework that you are using. That's okay. But for those beginners or for those middle level developers, they don't have to know that much. And then we come to the last part, which is the ecosystem. It contains some packages like the rotors, React Rotor or React Rotor. For me, I have only used the React Rotor before. Let me have a look at that. Well, it seems like for those companies, they are using the React framework. That's cool. But for other frameworks like the Vue.js, there aren't so many companies using it now. Okay. This is how you install that React Rotor package. Okay, here's the case. If you wanted to define the rotor, what you do is actually define those components together. For example, at the beginning, you get the roads, which is the base components. And then you get different roads. For each road, it has its own path, which is a part of the URL that you will use later if you want to go to that page. For example, here, the invoices send will give you an URL like invoices sent right in here. If you visit this URL, you'll be divided into this component. And of course, how can you go to a page or go to a rotor or roads? How can you get it there? There basically has two ways. The one is to use the static URL by defining a link. When user clicks that link, the user will get redirected to that road. This is one method. And another method is that you could use a function called the navigate. For example, here you use the use navigate, you get the navigate object. Then you use the navigate function to go to that URL. And also you could also get the URL parameters by using the use parameter right in here. For example, what is the parameter? For example, now you got a high equal to whatever, and in this case you could say parameters that's high. You would get this string. Okay, that's the React roads. Sorry, that's a React rotor packaging. Now let's go to the next one. How about the Next.js? This is also packaging. For this framework, the next, I think that's the right pronunciation. Okay, the Next.js gives you the best developer experience with all the features you need for production, hybrid static, and server rendering, TypeScript support, smart binding, world prefetching, and more. No configure is needed. So when you think about this, you will think, well, why you use the Next.js? Because it will allow you to do the server rendering, which means when when the user get the web page, it's already the static HTML code. So somehow it will, let's say, speed up the user's web page performance. So it reduces the time for your user to wait for the JavaScript rendering. So by using it, you could let your customer have a better experience about your website, especially if you are doing some static websites. For example, the official website of your company. It's definitely a static one. It only contains some text information and images. Or if you are creating a news website, which would full of some static articles. So in that case, you'd better using the React.js to do that kind of job. And then we comes to the next topic, API calls. Okay, so when it comes to the API calls, it basically means what kind of way you want to use or you want to follow to get some information from the server. There basically has two ways. One is to use the RESTful API, another is to use the gRPC kind of stuff. But here, if you are doing the RESTful calls, we normally would use the AXIOS. This is the library that we use most. It can be as simple as you give it the URL and you give it the JSON data, then you get the response back. Quite simple. And also for some people, they would more lovely to use the GraphQL. In that case, you are going to use the APOLLO. Well, I don't know why those people love to use this kind of method. I have no idea about that, but I could also do it without any problem because this is what I do in maybe a few months ago, 5 or 6 months ago. I work for the company that I worked for 1 year. Okay, if you want to do that, first you're gonna define the GraphQL language, for example, the query language, or how do you say it? Query language. Yeah, you define this, then you use it. For example, here, since you have defined the docs, so here you could query the docs, and it only contains two fields, the ID and the breadth. So you could use it like this, the ID and breadth. Well, this seems to be, let's say, quite easy. You don't have to worry about the types or any kind of that. You just have to define the types and use it right here. This is simpler than I do with the Flutter framework, because in the Flutter framework, after you have defined this, you have to also define those types by yourself, which is not convenient, but it seems like in the JavaScript it would be much simpler. Okay, oh, here we go. We can also use the React to make an mobile application. They use the React Native framework. But we could also use this one. It is also based on the React framework, but it got more components available for you. But it seems like it will need you to pay them to use the framework. So okay, then if those companies do not want to pay them at all, then we could use React Native. That's fine. Basically, for the React Native framework, everything remains the same except the layout system is kind of different. For example, here you got a new tag called the view. This is different. And for the text, it's also different. They got a lot of, let's say, fresh new tags, HTML tags that you need to get familiar with to be able to make the mobile application. But don't worry, it's not that easy. Oh, sorry, it's not that hard. Okay, then we're gonna go to the right part, which is forms. React hook form. What is that? I have never heard about that before. Well, speak of the forms, this is a general object, or let's say part of the web page that we would deal very frequently when we are making some product for a management system. Because whenever we want to input some information or data to the server, we have to create a form. And when we create a form, there basically has two things to do. One is to take the input. Another is to validate the input to say if the input is valid or not. And after the validation is all passed, then we could submit that data to the server. But this process can be a little bit frustrating if you do it from scratch. So that's why some people have created a library like this one, React hook form. Well, you could use it, but if you are using some other framework like the End Design framework for the React, then they also got the form components, which which contains the validation parts. Here we go, this one, the form. So you don't have to do it by yourself. And then comes with the testing parts. Well, for some standard company or for those companies who have a higher demand on the code quality, they would require you to make tests about the component that you are making, so that they could make sure that you are making the right user interface or the right components. So it is very critical for you to know how to make a test about your code, even if you are doing the front-end developments. So here, they normally use the JS packaging. This is how you install it. And after that, this is how you do the test. You call the test function, add a description for it, and make an exception about some variables to say if it's equal to something or not. It is that simple if you are doing the function test. But it may get much harder if you want to validate or test the component itself. For different framework, it has different methods. For example, here we go. Suppose that you have a component like this one, and how do you do the test for it? First, you're gonna import that components. Then you're gonna create that component by using render create with that components, and you're gonna expect something from your components, something like that. Well, it's also not that difficult as I think. Alright, then comes with the state management. There has tons of different methods for you to use. For example, you could use a built-in use context method or the state method, which would cover most of the use cases. But when things getting complicated, you may also use a Redux. That's a framework. I think it's somehow overcomplicated if you use it with a TypeScript support. But if you just want to use it with a JavaScript kind of stuff, then it can be much more simpler. For example, here you get the states and you get the action. You do something about the stats by recognizing different actions. Well, it's basically as I said. Oh, here we go. You can also create a storm. Oh, sorry, that's not right. The dispatch is a method to call different action. Well, I think this is just the same like the use Redux. I mean the built-in function. Oh, sorry, use reducer in the React. Somehow they are similar. But I don't know why people right now still love to use a Redux framework. It's not necessary for now. Okay, for the styling tools, you can use Material UI or the Enter Design. You know, before the Enter Design, I would more love to use Google's Material UI because I think that's a good design. But now I would use Enter Design because it saves a lot of time when you're making your own website, especially for some management system. Okay, and also there didn't cover any, let's say, SCSS or less framework, but they are also something that you should know, and I know them both. And here it also got a new framework called Emotion. That's the framework you use when you want to make some animations. Okay, so for now I just finished the whole learning for the React framework or tech stack. So basically, if I go to some interview, if they ask me some questions about the React, then I would, let's say, have 90% confidence to answer all those questions they ask me. So I think this is a nice try for all of us in the learning of the React. I hope you have learned something with me. Okay, that's it. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.